So we often get asked what the partnership does if we build stations, and we don't actually build any stations. We don't build fuel cell vehicles. What we do is we're a collaboration of industry and government organizations. The Fuel Cell Partnership brings these organizations together, and we work on expanding the market for hydrogen and fuel cell electric vehicles to help create a cleaner future. We have a little bit over 40 members in the Fuel Cell Partnership. Our most recent members include Tatsuno, PDC Machines, Cummins, and Solar Energy trade shows. And so if your organization is interested in being part of that conversation, please let us know how we can partner. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Keith Malone. He'll tell a little bit about himself and then also start the presentation for us. Keith?
Thank you, Ben. So in my role in public affairs, I work a lot in social media, legislative outreach, community outreach, news media relations. I do a lot of talking with news media folks, as well as kind of general, what I refer to as talking and writing about hydrogen and fuel cell related topics. And I'd like to follow up a little bit about our membership that Ben was talking about. If you look at our membership, I would estimate about 50 to 60% of our members work both pathways, whether they're government, private sector, or academic. And so embedded within the partnership is the recognition that there are two zero emission pathways, and that in order to get to that zero emission future, you need both. And so focusing more on this slide that you see before you, you've seen it before. We've made a few visual tweaks. Hopefully this is easier to read, but it really, I think, gives us a framework for talking today about where we are, where we hope to be shortly, and what we are envisioning down the road in 2030. And these are really the number of stations, 100, 200, 1,000. And so hopefully this can give you a way of kind of organizing this as we go through the slides and the activities. So next slide, and Dave, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Keith. So this is Dave Park. I'm with, I represent the partnerships, relationships between our industry members with a focus on establishing a healthy hydrogen fueling network. What you see is a overview of the snapshot of the system in California, which would include the vehicles and the fueling stations. We're up to a little over 8,000 fuel cell vehicles that have been sold into the California market since 2015. Currently, we have 41 hydrogen fueling stations that are open and available to drivers. You'll note that this number excludes the stations that are not available to serve drivers. We will go moving forward represent only those stations that are open and available to drivers. What's interesting is we do see an increase in activity in the heavy duty sector. What's not listed here is the activity in the truck sector, but we'll get to that. But there is also a healthy fuel cell bus market that's also emerging. Next slide, please. So the this is an overview of 2019 and moving a little snapshot into what's coming in 2020. But in late 2019, we had 4 stations open in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. I'll get into a little more detail on those stations on the next slide. We also had California State University's station added to our SOS system, which is the Station Operational Status System. We did see 4 stations come offline. West LA, unfortunately, that station was shut down permanently. And then we have 3 stations that are currently not available: Ontario, Riverside, and Newport Beach. And so we have, looking forward into 2020, we are looking at approximately 18 new hydrogen stations that will be opened. The next four we're anticipating are Woodside, Berkeley, Sherman Oaks, and Campbell. Next slide, please.
Dave, Campbell, is that the second station in Campbell or the?
That's correct. That will be the second station in Campbell. Thank you, Keith. And so talking about the general health of the network, as many of you know, there were some major disruptions to the hydrogen fueling network in 2019. We have since overcome those network disruptions, and the system is hardening, and we have several very interesting activities ongoing in the infrastructure development space that are insights into a growing, more healthy and less likely to be disrupted system. So we have new station growth, stations that have higher capacity hydrogen and resiliency in fuel supply. So the first thing that we're looking at is in December 2019, the California Energy Commission opened up their grant funding opportunity for the development of hydrogen stations. This is a large-scale project, a large-scale multi-year project. It's the first offering since 2015. We are seeing multiple fueling position stations with higher capacities. We're anticipating that those are the metrics that will be accepted by the Energy Commission, and stations that have backup fueling agreements to offset any supply disruptions for any one market player. We also have the California Air Resources Board's low carbon fuel standard and their HRI, hydrogen refueling infrastructure credit. And in that program, that's a program that will encourage private investment into the hydrogen station network. And we're looking at up to 1,200 kilogram stations, which are about 6 times the current capacity. And interesting look at Oakland, the Oakland station that was opened last year in the Bay Area. That's a 2 fueling position, 800 kilogram station. We're also seeing activity at the local air district level, where local air districts are also offering incentive funding to encourage development of hydrogen fueling stations within their geographic territories. Next slide, please. As many of you know, well, as we all know, COVID-19 has affected the entire world. California has designated fueling stations, including hydrogen fueling stations, as essential businesses. And so they are open and available during the shelter-in-place period. We have seen on the SOS system that stations are generally more available, and that's to be expected given the fact that shelter-in-place means that there is much only essential travel occurring, and therefore much less fuel usage across the board. Also, just one note during shelter-in-place is the pace of development of new stations has slowed. Critical activities that are considered critical are ongoing, but otherwise the development has stopped for those new stations. But we imagine that as the shelter-in-place is lifted, that activity will resume. Next slide, please. And so this is a look at a historic look at the activity of vehicle purchases and vehicles entering the market. This is the bars on this chart are a cumulative snapshot of vehicle population growth since 2015. And you can see that we're up at that 8,000 vehicle mark in 2020. we are in the first quarter, or just ended the first quarter 2020, just started the second, and we anticipate that that bar will climb in excess of 9,000 vehicles before the year's end. We see that stations open, so the lines on this chart are stations opened versus stations in development. The orangish line is stations opened, and the light blue line are stations in development. And so if you were to add those two numbers together, that would show that the total number of stations that were funded in that any particular year. And so what you see is, stations opened is growing somewhat linearly, and stations developed in development have dropped because, as soon as a station is developed, it moves into that stations opened category. But overall, what you see is that that total number has plateaued. And what we're expecting that with the issuing of this next GFO, grant funding opportunity by the California Energy Commission to develop new stations, that stations in development line will jump in the next year. And then we'll see a similar growth pattern over the next 2020 to 2025 range. But currently, if we were to look at this snapshot in real time, what it would express is that station development has plateaued while vehicle growth continues to climb. We're hoping that 2020 will be a pivotal year, and again, this trend will reverse, and we'll see an upsurge in development. And now I'll hand it over to Keith for the next slide.
So many of you have seen us if you've participated in previous webinars, we've always talked about hydrogen and hydrogen on a renewable pathway. And more specifically, we've mostly talked about hydrogen as a fuel. And so I wanted to, there's been probably many of you who are attending the webinar have recognized just in the last couple of years, there's been kind of a reframing of hydrogen, or an understanding of hydrogen, that it's more than just a fuel. You have projects like Hydrogen at Scale, and a lot of recent reports that have been coming out that recognize that hydrogen fuel is part of a much larger ecosystem of hydrogen production. And so I first want to focus on the US. Obviously in California, we've put hydrogen fuel on a renewable pathway. Many of us remember that at minimum 33% of the hydrogen being dispensed to vehicles has to come from renewable sources. With the new low carbon fuel standard infrastructure credit that Dave just mentioned, that number goes up to 40%. And in the background, we have a number of our members who are working on legislative language that will put hydrogen fully on that renewable pathway, that will put it on that pathway to 100% renewable content. Given what's been going on with COVID-19, kind of legislative activity up in Sacramento is being largely refocused on kind of the COVID crisis and how we deal with that. We don't have a lot of information at the moment, so it is possible that we may not get to this year, but likely, if not this year, next year, you're going to see language that does what we've done in California to the electrical grid, which is put it on its pathway to 100% renewable content. So in the background, or here in the US, we have a number of projects that are reflective of, first off, the growth in the fuel cell vehicle market, and also the need for hydrogen as energy storage or as a means of providing power. So you've seen in the last 2 years the announcement by Air Liquide. They are building a renewable liquid plant in North Las Vegas. We have the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power that is building a new power project in Utah that will begin with mostly using natural gas with some hydrogen mix, probably about 25%. Ultimately, 20 to 30 years down the road being 100% renewable hydrogen. You also have recently, Air Products has announced, they announced about 2 years ago the construction of a new plant, plus recently they've made plant purchases in California, and in those announcements reference the fuel cell vehicle market. And not listed on here as well, you have the Mitsubishi Hitachi Power Systems project in Utah as well, renewable energy production that also includes hydrogen as energy storage. And then kind of giving us this larger perspective, we saw later last year and early this year the release of the US hydrogen roadmap. And as to be expected, it focuses on this broader sort of context for hydrogen, not just transportation and mobility, but also as for industry and energy storage and a tool to be used in the energy transition. But one of the interesting things I think we want to look at and is reflective of this kind of larger perspective are the 19 companies that participated in the development of this document. And I've embedded that just below the roadmap cover. And you've got a number of companies. You can see Microsoft and Exelon and others that haven't traditionally been part of this larger conversation. And I'll pull out another one. We have Audi, for example. A lot of people will point to the fact that VW has shifted to battery electric vehicles, but Audi is part of the Volkswagen family. They've, in the last year or so, they've joined the Hydrogen Council, and they've participated in this. So I would offer that, you know, there's some really interesting indicators coming out of this report, just looking at the names here. And of course, the the report was put together by McKinsey, along with input from EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. So all of these really interesting sorts of players are coming together, and we're beginning to see this larger recognition of hydrogen. Next slide, please. And as you look kind of globally, we also had the release of the Hydrogen Council's report on hydrogen, their path to competitiveness, looking across multiple industries, lots of data points, multiple countries, and this recognition that, you know, they see a 50% reduction in hydrogen solutions coming sooner than later. Kind of buttressing that, we've had Bloomberg New Energy Fund with their analysis, and even some recent articles coming out of them as well. And one of the interesting things in these reports, as well as recent announcements responding to COVID and the calls for stimulus packages, is this recognition that we still need the partnership between government and the private sector, that we are in this early phase, and that in order to develop these, to really help launch hydrogen and fuel cell electric vehicles, we need to lay additional policy foundations. And so you're beginning to see this recognition globally. And as you'll see below the report, I've also put that you now have 18 governments who've put together detailed strategies. And I think that number goes up to 19 now, that the Netherlands recently issued in the last couple of days their hydrogen strategy. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ben.
Thanks, Keith. So what I want to highlight are 3 resources that are available to you as either a stakeholder or general public, or a current fuel cell electric vehicle driver or a potential driver. So the first is we have our website. It's found at cafcp.org. And again, we will have all of our links available with the presentation that will be posted. On our website, we have, again, our resources section. We have our by the numbers page, which Dave showed earlier as a snapshot. This page is updated on a monthly basis. It, again, highlights the number of vehicles sold, as well as stations that are either in development or open in California. We also have our blog, and so this is typically where we will post the Q&A, as well as the documents that are going to be made available after this webinar. We also list all of the events that Fuel Cell Partnership staff participate at, as well as events that pertain to hydrogen fuel cell technology. You are also welcome to submit an event if you feel that it would help move the technology forward. Staff here will review it and post it onto the site as appropriate. And then we also recently added our news section, and so Keith Malone manages this list here, and it's a collection of all of the news articles related to hydrogen and fuel cell technology, and so there's multiple filters on here if there's a particular area that you're looking for. And of course, the resources section. This is a tool that the Fuel Cell Partnership staff put together primarily for ourselves for when we're doing our work, and so a really good tool. But for you might be interested in the hydrogen stations list, for instance. This list has all of the stations that are currently open in green here, as well as all the stations that are in development. So all these stations below the green stations, it shows you when they're expected to open, what the current status is in the commissioning process or the development process, as well as any additional notes associated with it. The second resource that I wanted to share is our station map. And so this map here, it shows, again, the green dots represent stations that are currently open and available. We also have the yellow dots for stations that are in development. And then we also have, recently we've added heavy duty stations. These stations aren't shown by default. So if you're interested in bus stations or truck stations, clicking on the filter here will show those stations. This station is reactive, and so if you're looking for stations that are close to you, you can also look at the list view. And again, depending on where you're focusing on the map, it will adjust this list based on where you're looking. You can also do a search by zip code as well. And then again, that list that I've recently shown can be downloaded using this list, this link here as well. And then the last tool I want to highlight is our station operational tool, or station operational status system that Dave talked about earlier. This tool is primarily for customers of fuel cell electric vehicles. It tells you in real time what the current status is of each station in California. We have, if a station is shown a green circle, that means that it is currently online and operational. A yellow triangle means that you can get fuel, but you're not going to get full fill. A red square here means that it's currently offline and not accessible. And then a question mark means that we've lost data connectivity. And so if you do see a question mark, please use the customer service number to check in and see if that station is operational. We also have these information icons here. So the station developers have direct access to the system, and they will typically add in notes to this page here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here. Also at the bottom of the page, we also have a link to any updates that we have in regards to any disruptions to the supply of hydrogen in California. But again, the best source is looking at that at each individual station with the information icon. So again, clicking on an individual station will take you into a more deeper into a page with more deeper information. It will tell you again what the status is for each position, as well as looking on your phone, you can get a map view of where that station is, so you can map it to from your location to that station. We also provide the customer service number. SOS also has the capability to allow you to sign up for an account, so you can sign up here and then sign up to receive text or email notifications for when the station changes status. So when it goes offline, it will either text you or email you, depending on your preference. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Keith, I believe.
Yes. So obviously with this webinar, we try and focus as much as possible on California and try and provide context for what we're doing. Obviously, I often joke that California is the down payment on everyone else's clean air in the US. But in order for this model to work, we need to see it be successful in other states. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest as well. Not a lot of updates in the Pacific Northeast. One of the challenges they've had is really getting tunnel approval. It looks as though they're moving ahead, getting tunnel approval in Massachusetts and Boston. They've been working with Sandia National Labs to make that happen. But one of the really interesting things to really remind people about the Northeast, and this is a project between Toyota and Air Liquide. The fuel coming from this project is going to be coming out of a 20 megawatt electrolyzer project, the largest one that we know of to date around the globe. They're doing it, Air Liquide is doing it in partnership with Hydrogenics. This is, I think a very interesting representation, I think, of where we all want to be and see various states, where we want to see things going. Apologies, that wasn't really well said. Let's go to the Pacific Northwest. The next page, please. So first off, I want to apologize to my colleagues in Canada and British Columbia as we talk about the Pacific Northwest and the North American West Coast. I couldn't find a map that adequately includes California, Oregon, Washington, and BC. Because when we talk about hydrogen and fuel cell electric vehicles on the West Coast, it's really important to think about that North American West Coast hydrogen highway from Baja California to British Columbia, from BC to BC. We've seen in the last month or so that Washington is going to adopt California's ZEV mandate, similar to what Oregon and British Columbia have done. And it really is this interesting moment in which you're seeing these West Coast states and provinces adopting increasingly identical or similar policies that are in alignment that potentially give us opportunities for more in the production of renewable hydrogen, in the development of a hydrogen fueling infrastructure that extends beyond California, as well as some other interesting opportunities as well, possible group vehicle purchasing, et cetera. But there's a lot of activity going on, and I have only highlighted a few items. And there's a lot percolating up in the state of Washington and Oregon. We have colleagues at the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance out of the Northwest. They're doing a lot of lobbying work, helping to make sure that we're seeing further policy development. And I think as we look forward, I wouldn't be surprised if you see in the next year or so stakeholders coming together across at least those 4 states, and perhaps even those states that buttress them. So folks like coming out of Nevada and Utah, where you're beginning to see hydrogen production activity, and coming together and trying to figure out how we can work in tandem and leverage the strengths of each state and region. Next slide. I'm going to turn it back over to Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So as mentioned earlier, the emerging heavy-duty hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle market is a very exciting space to the industry. The reason is that the heavy-duty sector, development of the heavy-duty sector, really completes the economic cycle or circle for this emerging new fuel economy. And that is that heavy-duty and light-duty, both classes of vehicles, are synergistically linked in that the two categories of vehicles create a healthy economy that helps the other achieve economies of scale on a much faster timeline. And so it's noted that this really is a very remarkable technology, and it's worth reminding folks that this economic market really launched in 2015, which in the timeline of motor vehicle development is a very short period. We just entered year 5 of this new economy. And from that perspective, as light-duty vehicle manufacturing ramps up, we have production of fuel cells increasing in volumes, and that should bring the price of fuel cell power plants and vehicles down. It's been proven that those fuel cell power plants can translate directly to a Class 8 heavy-duty tractor. And then as a heavy-duty tractor market emerges, or just heavy-duty truck market and truck and bus market evolve, we'll see much larger demand in fuel. And so that will help bring the price of fuel down. And just as an example, that Oakland station that I mentioned previously at 800 kilograms, we're seeing dramatic drops in price, where the state average price of hydrogen is now $16 a kilogram. We're seeing pump prices at Oakland as low as $12 a kilogram, and an industry goal to get the price of hydrogen down below $10 a kilogram. With heavy duty uptake of hydrogen, that drop in price will occur much faster. So where we are today is we have several demonstration projects going on in the heavy duty truck space, where we have trucks coming out of the ports of LA and Long Beach that will be working the drayage corridor in the LA region. We have several heavy-duty regulatory efforts ongoing at the California Air Resources Board, including the development of an advanced clean trucks rule. And then also we have their innovative clean transit rule, which has been adopted, and the transit agencies across the state are required to start submitting their plans for complying with that regulation this year. We see activity in the bus space with a 25 bus order, and then we see development of heavy duty sized hydrogen fueling stations at AC Transit, OC Transit, and Sunline Transit. And then the partnership itself, we have pulled together a roadmap for deployment of transit buses, hydrogen fuel cell transit buses, and we published that document in 2019. You can find that on our resources page. And then we have a 100 bus order that Keith can elaborate on. Keith?
So if you look at right now, earlier when we did the by the numbers page, one item that will be updated shortly, we quarterly query transit agencies about their tallies of fuel cell buses. What you'll see is in the last year or so, we've seen a significant increase. We're now at about 40 some odd fuel cell buses. One of the things the next update will include is at least there's 5 additional buses in the pipeline with Golden Empire Transit Agency in Bakersfield, bringing fuel cell buses to their region. But a lot of the buses you're seeing now are the result of a 25 bus order that came out of a 2018 CARB funding opportunity. And we were able to show that we could take the price of buses further down with that large purchase order. And in the background, you have folks, actually our colleagues at the Center for Transportation and the Environment, working on a 100 bus project, reaching out to transit agencies, putting together this large group purchasing opportunity. And they are working with New Flyer, and they see the potential for getting under the $900,000 per bus cost. Ultimately, the goal that stakeholders have set is ultimately getting to $650,000. But if we, with that 100 bus order, can get below $900,000, then I think you're going to see more transit agencies beginning to look more seriously at fuel cell buses. We are certainly seeing that right now with the new innovative clean transit rule, as they begin to look at what it looks like to scale up both battery electric and fuel cell electric buses. You're finding a number of these transit agencies seeing the value of fuel cell buses in the 20-year history we have here in California. Next slide, please. So we've probably given you a really high level 60,000 foot sort of peek at what's going on in California and beyond. Normally in previous webinars, we have embedded links in the slides themselves, and this time we thought we would put them together in one slide. So it's dense, it's a little hard to read, but we'd appreciate any feedback you have about this. We just thought it would be easier for everyone to have them all on one slide. And Ben, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Thanks, Keith. And so as previously mentioned, we are going to open up for Q&A, but we're not going. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left, and so we're not going to be able to answer all the questions, but we will summarize and try to answer as many as we can today. And then later on this week, we will answer the rest of the questions and post those the Q&A along with the presentation slides and the recording onto our website, and then we will send out a link to all of the information. So with that, we're going to open up for our Q&A, and first I'm going to punt the first one to Dave. I know, Dave, you're looking at some of the questions and wanted to respond to questions about the hydrogen infrastructure development. Dave?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Yeah, I saw a number of questions come in regarding the pace of hydrogen fueling station development versus the pace of new vehicle sales, and we are seeing, well, if you look at the language of the California Energy Commission's current grant offering on the development of hydrogen fueling stations, you'll notice that they have issued this notion of what are called tranches and batches. And so the Energy Commission approach to development of new stations is they are selecting applicants who have what they define as a tranche. And a tranche would be a multi-batch. So a tranche would be larger than a batch. A tranche would be a multi-batch plan for development of hydrogen fueling stations. So they're taking a long-term view at the development of stations. And so presumably applicants who are awarded these grant funds, they will be awarded one batch at a time. Well, their entire application would be awarded, but then they would be awarded one batch at a time and build out that batch of stations. And what we anticipate is that we will have an accelerated pace of development, and the indicators are that we have new entrants coming into the hydrogen fueling station developmental marketplace because this economy really is picking up. And then if you look at our website, on our resources page, you will see a list of the stations that our automotive partners have identified, or geographic regions that our automotive partners have identified as their high market opportunity locations, to provide some guidance to the California Energy Commission as where the automakers would like to see development of hydrogen fueling stations. And that list gets down to a very specific, major artery, interstate intersection location detail. Thank you, Ben.
Welcome. So the next question, I think this might be for Keith. We have a question about the Hydrogen Council. The Global Hydrogen Council, based out of Europe, has adopted a policy to achieve decarbonized hydrogen for transportation in 2030. Does the California Fuel Cell Partnership support this, have the same or similar goal?
Yes. Well, and also to bear in mind that many of the Hydrogen Council members are members of the Fuel Cell Partnership as well. And so if you look at the legislation that's being developed, I think the goal is to accelerate as quickly as possible, getting to renewable hydrogen, but it obviously is going to take steps. It's going to take other policy mechanisms to really launch that renewable hydrogen market. you know, just like we did with solar and wind. So I will say, and if you look at the partnerships 2030 vision document, and we have a link to it as well, you can find it on our website, you will see that commitment too. But just like I also said, in order to get there, we need partnership with government. And so kind of in the background of all that we're saying is, for those of you that want to see this zero emission pathway, this fuel cell electric and hydrogen pathway take off, it requires your participation as well, talking to legislators and other policymakers.
Thanks, Keith. Dave, I think this next question is for you. So we have a few questions about the stations that closed, the 4 stations there. Can you share you know, why they were closed and what's the or not closed, but why they're not currently available?
Sure, I can talk to at a very high level about these. I'm going to start with West LA first because that's probably the most visible, because that station has been permanently closed. That was unfortunate. All these events are unforeseen, but West LA specifically, the owner of that station, that property was sold for redevelopment into, I believe, a housing development, and therefore that site was lost permanently. The station was decommissioned. The equipment has been taken back by the station owner, and we don't know whether that equipment will be transferred to another developmental project. On the other stations, I can't get into specifics, but right now we saw inactivity at those stations. They stopped operation, and we have established a new metric for listing stations on our SOS system, and that's if a station becomes inactive for 30 days or more, we notify the station that it will be coming off of our SOS platform. As I understand, those stations are in limbo for various reasons. I know that the state, those are all state-funded stations, and the state agencies that are, or the public agencies that helped develop those stations are in discussion with those station owners to see if we can get those stations back on track and reopened. But we have no prospect for what those timelines might be.
Thanks, Dave. And if I'll add too, you know, there was also a question about why these stations, you know, if it's the same reason for our closing and or not being available. And we have seen stations like the Torrance station, for example, that went offline to be upgraded. And so typically we do have some legacy stations that are being upgraded, and so you may see that from time to time. Next question in regards to slide 6. So, Dave, I believe you mentioned that that the stations were going to get up to 1,200 kilograms, 6 times the current demand. Is that 6 times the current demand, or 6 times the current capacity of the smaller stations?
Yes, thank you for the clarifying question. That's 6 times that 6 times number is pinned to the very first stations that were developed. So when hydrogen stations were first introduced to the marketplace, they were approximately 200 kilogram per day stations. And now we're seeing them roll out at higher and higher levels of on-site hydrogen storage. And so when we say 1,200 kilograms, that would be 6 times current capacity. Maybe I'll point out that, you know, earlier I mentioned Cal State LA. We introduced Cal State LA to the SOS system, and that's an example. In fact, Cal State LA probably was the first hydrogen station to be introduced into the state, and that's why it was introduced to SOS, the SOS platform, to show that that resource was available to drivers. But we've designated it as a legacy retail station because it has a low volume of hydrogen or available on a daily basis. And therefore, we wanted to forewarn drivers that, yes, if you visit that station later in the day, it may not have fuel. It may be closed, so please check sauce before visiting that station. But absolutely, that 1,200 kilogram per day station metric at 6 times capacity that we were using that original, those early, those initial stations as our baseline.
Thanks, Dave. And while we're on here, there was also a question about what's the difference between H70 and H35.
It's the pressure at which hydrogen is dispensed, and so H70 that it's dispensed at a higher pressure, and therefore you can pack more hydrogen molecules into a tank at a higher pressure. And H70 has become the standard for, generally the standard for light duty automotive. There is so you can pack at higher pressure, you can pack more molecules in at a faster rate.
Thanks, Dave. And so while I'm on this page here, there were a couple of questions about sauce in regards to improvements to sauce. We're always looking for feedback and suggestions. And so if you do have I won't touch on all of them today, but if you do have a suggestion, please do send an email to me, and I'll have my email provided later on. And we're always looking to improve the system. There was a question about how often we get information. So this data is being sent for the most part. For example, the 2.0 stations, they send us data in real time. The air product stations, those stations are all transmitting data in 1 minute increments, so essentially real time. And so I think the longest duration is 5 minutes, so fairly quick. If you are wondering, we do have a timestamp of when it was last updated. So for instance, here it was last updated at 12:51. All right, looking at the list of questions here. Dave, I think we have another question for you. You talked earlier about the in-development stations. Did those in-development stations that you talked about, did they include the 9 HRI stations? The LCFS?
Those do not include the HRS stations or the LCFS funded stations. We are currently discussing with our membership how we might represent those stations on our station map and in our station count, but currently the LCFS stations are not included in the count. But we see LCFS as a very exciting tool because it's a economic incentive for private investors to get into the station development game, so that it's not just public funds going into the development of the fueling network.
Can I add some context to this for those who aren't familiar with what we're talking about, these 9 stations? For those, we have some stations that have qualified for the new LCFS infrastructure capacity credit, but they have not received funding from other sources. So they're in this sort of unique place that we haven't been before. And so that's what Dave and Ben have been referring to in that. Dave, does that add to it? I hope I helped clarify that.
Very much. Thank you very much for adding that color.
And there is a link in those references, folks, to that infrastructure credit page on the CARB website.
Keith, I think this next question's for you. It's about the Bloomberg study. In the reference to the Bloomberg study, does plummeting mean supply or cost of hydrogen?
Oh, plummeting as in cost. It's really, if you look at Bloomberg and all these other studies, it's really kind of what a lot of our stakeholders have been talking about for years, that with volume, comes, you know, reductions in per unit costs. And so now that, you know, first off, we're seeing a lot of the consultancies are now pivoting towards hydrogen in a way they never have. Partly, I think, as a result of they have clients who want to get their arms around it, and also because they see what's happening and they want to make sure that they kind of stay ahead of it all. But we are getting these reports and studies now that say we can get there. And I'll tell you, many of our stakeholders, we see a business case. In order to get to that business case, we still need partnership with government and specific policies, but generally speaking, it really means about cost. It's not about hydrogen availability at all.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I think this next question is also for you as well. How can cities in California engage with the growth of this emerging market?
First off, I would say a couple things. One, talk with your local gas station owners about kind of what their needs are, where they're going. I would put to you, especially to remember that hydrogen offers many of these gas station owners an on-ramp to renewables. This is their just transition. This gives them a new income stream in a way that perhaps charging stations may not. But I'd say for cities, one, make sure that you have policies that are supportive of hydrogen. At the very least, making sure that these policies are technology neutral when it comes to permitting and planning, especially. I would say for cities, look at, are we a city that would benefit from fuel cell electric vehicle fleets? Right now, it's mostly focused on the light duty sector. That's where you're probably going to access some of them early on. There are a number of different ways you can do that. And if you are a city, I would be very happy to talk with you and connect you up with right people to further help you.
Thanks, Keith.
Ben, I'm just going to return quickly back to the stations, the 4 stations that became unavailable in 2019. I forgot to mention that the Newport Beach site, that station actually is in the process of being upgraded, and so it will reopen. It'll be reopened at a much at higher capacity and than the original station. That station also was one of the older stations in the network.
Thanks, Dave. Got an easy question for you here. I think this is for Dave. So in this slide here, Dave, you talked about the 200 station, and you talked about a report that you were referencing. What report are you referencing?
I think that was Keith that mentioned that. Okay. I can address the 200 station topic though. To start with, is the 200. There are 2 goals. There is the Senate or Assembly Bill 8 order to develop 100 hydrogen filling stations in California, and then that was followed by Governor Brown's executive order for the state to achieve 200 fueling stations. And so those 2 really go hand in hand. The difference being that first 100 stations that Assembly Bill 8, ordered, for that bill provided economic surety in the development of those stations, whereas the governor's order was never funded. Getting to that question of how can the public help? Well, you can encourage your legislators to fund that governor's order so that we can get more infrastructure development funds into the build out of this refueling network. But Keith, do you have anything further regarding that study?
The report, perhaps we mentioned, maybe I think I was referring to the partnership's 2030 vision, also known as the fuel cell revolution. And that one really focuses on the 1,000 station goal. 1,000 stations serving upwards of 1 million fuel cell cars, buses, and trucks. And just in the search box there, just type in revolution, and there'll be a number of documents that'll come up too.
Thanks, Keith. So we're a minute over the hour here, and so I want to be respectful of your time. Again, we will have we'll look at the rest of the questions here and respond to those questions and post those on our blog later next week. And so again, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today. As always, if you have any feedback for us or have any questions, or if you have any would like to propose for other webinars that you would like for us to host, please do let us know. Again, we will have all three of our emails made available to you later on. So again, thank you, and hope you all are doing well during this time.